Today, I do have the immense pleasure of talking to one of the great authorities in different areas of knowledge, like Buddhism, Asian medicine, and is no other than Professor Geoffrey Samuel. Professor Samuel is Emeritus Professor in the School of History, Archaeology and Religion at Cardiff University, and also is an Honorary Associate of the Department of Indian Sub-Continental Studies at the University of Sydney. Professor Samuel is or has been a visiting professor to different universities. His academic background is in physics and social anthropology. And he is very much interested as he's an expert on Tibetan religion and society. And he researched with Tibetans and Nepals and India. He is a very well-recognized work. He's the author of different books, among which are Mind, Body, and Culture, Anthropology, and the Biological Interface. Another book, very interesting one, is Introducing Tibetan Buddhism. And one of the main books I have read of Professor Geoffrey Samuel is The Origins of Yoga and Tantra, a very specialized book, very interesting and very recommendable to everybody interested in this field of yoga and Tantra and Indic religions. Professor Geoffrey Samuel, thank you very much indeed for accepting my invitation to talking with you. It's for me a pleasure and an honor to have you in these conversations. So would you mind start telling me, how did your interest arise about these Asian philosophies like yoga, Tantrism, and Buddhism, and also Asian medicine?
Well, first, I'd really like to thank you, Martina, for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure to take part in an occasion like this, and quite an honor too. And how did I first become interested in this? You mentioned that my initial qualifications were in physics, which seems some way away from what we're talking about here. Social anthropology, which maybe is a little bit closer. In some ways, they both feed into what happened later. But at around the time when I became involved in these things, I suppose this was back in the late 60s, 1960s, I was a young person who was becoming interested in meditation, in Asian forms of practice, Tai Chi, whatever, beginning to learn about Buddhism. And at the same time, I was also feeling, well, do I actually want to spend the rest of my life as a physicist? Is this quite the right direction? And somehow this all came together in the idea of doing anthropological research on Buddhism and specifically on Tibetan Buddhism. And so that's where I started off. But there was always a level of personal involvement in the practice side, as well as an intellectual and academic involvement in trying to understand what was going on, primarily within an anthropological framework, though I think also in other ways as well. I think there's always a kind of philosophical interest too. And certainly a practical interest. So I think what in part that means is, and to some extent that comes through in the Origins of Yoga and Tantra book, that I was always trying to understand why people are doing these things, how they fit into the wider social, cultural, intellectual context of their times. And that particular book, in some ways, is a kind of, I used to think of it as a kind of prequel, you know, in the sense of a film prequel or whatever, to my writings on Tibet, because I started studying Tibetan Buddhism. A lot of the first part of my career was really just trying to work out enough to get some kind of picture of what was going on in Tibet. And Tibet is a pretty complicated place. There's a lot of variation, a lot of things which are not very obvious at first sight. And so I found I had to get a picture of Tibetan society, the variation in Tibetan society, the different kinds of places where, if you like, Tibetan Buddhism took root in Tibet, and what it was doing for different groups of people and why, and then I began to make some sense of Tantra. But of course, Tantra didn't come from Tibet. It came primarily from India, as far as the Tibetans were concerned, and so at the same time, and also becoming involved to some extent in some level of tantric practice. This is very interesting and strange stuff, and I wanted to know where it came from, and so that led me to becoming interested in more in the Indian material, or South Asian material, and so in the writing the Yoga and Tantra book. The interest in health and medicine kind of grew up along the same time as all this was happening. Like a lot of things in my life, I think in my academic life, it came out of an encounter with one of my students who wanted to work on Tibetan medicine and Tibetan healing. This was Elise Dutchbury, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but was very interested in Tibetan medicine, and one way or another, along with another colleague in Australia. At that stage, I was living in Australia. We got involved in a research project on Tibetan medicine, and then that developed in different ways, and that got me involved with the wider field of Asian medicine and so on. And then I think tying all these together perhaps is just trying to understand how these complex processes of mind and body and consciousness and reality and our connection with the wider world that we're part of operates. So that perhaps was the more philosophical or intellectual basis of all of this. Well, so that's a quick glimpse, maybe.
Yeah, extremely highly interesting. So now let's see. Nowadays, as we know, there is a lot of interest in our society about meditation. Basically, most of the people know about mindfulness. So it's very much related with Buddhism. Now, in my opinion, it's out of the context, of the deep philosophy that Buddhism teaches. We have, in our modern society, medicalized all this type of techniques and methods. I'd like to know your opinion about this. How, is being inserted in our society in such a way that it looks like a panacea. It reminds me, in a sense, when the TM, Transcendental Meditation, the initiation to the mantras with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, that it seemed it was going to save the whole world of every bad situation and so on and so forth. So I'd like to know your opinion about this.
Yes. Well, I think a lot of us have been rather concerned about the way in which mindfulness became a panacea, and mindfulness was appearing all around the place in all sorts of different contexts, without very much understanding of what it meant in its original context, or without much understanding either of its complexity. And I think the mindfulness practices are only part of a wider spectrum of yogic and meditational and mind-body transformative practices. They're suitable for some people in some situations, and maybe less for others in other situations. So at one point I got involved in a research project on people on the autism spectrum, for example, and mindfulness seemed to be quite a problematic approach, and many of them, whereas other sorts of meditation might have been more helpful. But we were in the middle of the mindfulness epidemic, if you like, or craze, and so they were being given mindfulness too, so yes, I mean, I think I'm very concerned, again, like many of us, with the medicalization of these processes, but it's a two-way process too, because firstly, the influence is going both directions, I think. A kind of serious encounter with Buddhist and yogic procedures and other Asian modalities of human development leads to, it's also a challenge to science, and often quite consciously. I mean, I think people like, say, Richie Davidson or Anton Lutz, or some of the sort of leading figures in the yogic studies area, they were doing this in part because they're already quite committed to the value of Buddhism, or the matter John Kabat-Zinn, who of course popularized the mindfulness-based stress reduction. So this was a kind of, at one level, it can seem like an appropriation, a sort of hostile takeover, but it can also be an opening through which something comes through. And for me, I think I try to look for kind of balance here. It seems to me that the mechanisms through which Western and increasingly global society operates are very problematic. I think many of us can probably agree with that, and they're obviously not functioning very well in relation to the whole series of major crises that we seem to be facing, or maybe crisis is too weak a word. The general predicament of drastic climate change, increasing levels of economic inequality, political unrest, and not to say things like the war in the Ukraine, and so on and so on. I mean, that we're going through a very risky and vulnerable period in some ways, and we don't seem to have a great deal of wisdom to face it with, or at least not built into the system that we're operating by. And so while I think it's unwise, and it's ultimately not really helpful to take some bit of Asian wisdom and say, this is the solution, there is a lot to be gained if we can open ourselves up to other ways of looking at who we are in the world, how we relate to each other, to the planet, you know, to other life on the planet. So I don't really see Buddhism as the solution, but I don't see Hindu thought as the solution, but I do see elements of both of them as things that could be very helpfully integrated into what's an increasingly global situation anyway. I don't know whether that's clear, but that's kind of the way I tend to see things, which is there is a lot here of very great potential value that can help the world, if it allows it to happen, to meet what is happening in a more, I don't know, graceful, humanly sensitive, less destructive way. And so from that point of view, I very much value it. But we do have to watch out for all these processes of assimilation and appropriation and medicalization and rework. So, you know, meditation just becomes a way to keep the machinery of global capitalism and exploitation working a bit more smoothly, you know. And obviously people have written quite a bit about that, and I think I'm very much on side with that agenda as something that we need to worry about. But I don't think that's a reason to abandon the whole project. And I don't think that most of the people who are objecting to what's going on would want that anyway.
Yeah, because as you said, it seems to be quite right to me. And the emphasis in our society seems to be the well-being of the body-mind mechanisms that we are devoting so much attention to. However, I do remember myself being young. I was fascinated by the Asian countries and India, because all these countries, all these philosophies of liberation, salvific philosophies, or whatever you want to call them, or the perennial philosophy, was like having the chance, the opportunity to have a different state of mind. You know, of course, we are not going to go to aspire to nirvana, samadhi, or any other state, you know, as the Upanishads can talk about mukti or moksha, for instance. But in a sense, all these methods, all these techniques, all this philosophy seems to be now divided. Like in our society, as Tagore used to say, we are looking outwards, I mean, in the physical world, in the material world, in order to try to control it and feel better ourselves within, you know, this scheme. However, in the Oriental world, it's like closing the eyes to go inside and to discover and explore more deeply yourself. Now here, we come across with a difficulty is the problem of consciousness, or the body-mind problem. So, according to your studies, investigations, and research in the world of meditation, Buddhism, yoga, Tantrism, what is your opinion about consciousness? Consciousness is the product of the evolution, and it comes all the way up to where we are. Does consciousness, in a sense, exist already and expresses through, you know, different things in the world we are living in? I know the question is not easy, but we can give any opinion like everybody else.
Yes. I think,
Geoffrey, in other words, what I'm trying to say, in a sense, that at least you know, you see all these bhikkhus, all these great lamas and monks and yogis. In a sense, they are looking for something beyond the body-mind mechanisms. But in a sense, we just trying just to stop old age, to be fully healthy the years we have to live. But it seems to be we do not aspire to anything beyond our egoism or whatever, our ego or whatever you want to call it. To enrich ourselves more spiritually, that is the main point of these philosophies from Asia that they're having offering us all these type of things. And through this meditation from Theravada or the great masters that I heard you mention in some of your videos, you know, like Uba King or Goenka or Mahasi Sayadaw or any other, okay, or even the great teachers, lamas from Tibet. So do you think that in our society, we are expert in you know, in social anthropology and this type of things, we do aspire really to get this type of experiences that the Indic religions are offering us in a sense?
I think maybe we can learn to get closer to what these practices are in their Asian context. I remember thinking about the difference between a Tibetan monastery and a Western Dharma center, you know, in the Buddhist world. In the Tibetan monastery, you maybe have quite a large monastery, and you have a relatively small group of people who might be advanced yogic practitioners. In fact, the advanced yogic practitioners might be up in some small hermitage up the valley, but you know, and you have lots of people who are basically just keeping the place going, maybe doing the cooking and the cleaning and maintaining the outward direction of the institution, which is helping the local community. And this is okay because there is a sense of the monastery as a collective undertaking, that is something that's happening on behalf of the society as a whole. There's often very close links to the local village community or town or whatever. Now, if you move to the Western Dharma Center, everybody wants to get enlightenment, nirvana, whatever, Buddhahood, as soon as possible, of course. And nobody's necessarily that interested in doing the cooking and the managing. It's a much more egotistic, at one level, approach to the whole thing. But the thing there is that in a way that doesn't actually work. And because the practices are not really detached from their emotional context and their moral context. And they only really work, I think. And in a way, this is very clear in the Tibetan context with the teachings on bodhicitta, you know, on the underlying motivation of compassion, that is how you get to Buddhahood, you know. And I think that's something that people are gradually realizing. I think, you know, when Buddhism went to Tibet, it arrived maybe in the early 7th century. It's a little bit hazy. It probably took about 4 or 5 centuries for things to really start settling down. Well, I mean, things, you know, the first Westerners to be ordained as Buddhist monks were, you know, around 1900. So, I mean, things have been happening for a while. But nevertheless, I mean, these are processes that that can't really be rushed too much. So I'm not pessimistic that more and more people will come to a deeper understanding of what these practices are really about. Maybe to a certain extent that also answers the question about consciousness, because I think if we think of consciousness as something that's going on in our personal mind, or even worse, brain, then that's quite limiting. If we think of ourselves as one node, one point in a much more complex field, which one level includes all life on the planet, then it's a bit different. And I mean, I have, I suppose, guesses and intuitions about the relationship between consciousness and the body and the material level. But I don't think they're more than that. And I don't want to push them too far. One of the things I've been doing quite recently was I've been involved in some joint work with a neuroscientist, Maria Korzhevnikov, who does very interesting experimental work on Buddhist Tantra, and quite sensitive to the wider processes that are involved in it. But and like all of these kind of interdisciplinary projects, I mean, just getting to the point where you understand the other person and what they're doing enough to be able to say anything takes quite a long time. It was quite a challenging experience. But at one level, it was very positive to see how far Maria was able to get in terms of understanding some of the specific processes of tantric practice, as opposed to, say, the mindfulness type practices. And she sees them, and I think has shown this quite effectively, as very different, and as engaging the nervous system in very different ways, and also as which I think is important, as part of an ongoing process. So you can't, I think, understand a tantric practice in terms of doing a single thing. You're doing a series of things that is moving you or transforming you in various ways, and both on the occasion of a particular, say, meditation session, or a particular application, because these are also things that might be used in terms of health, or in terms of other positive impacts on the wider group. You're not simply moving into this. This is part of a sequence of practices and events, a wider connection to the world that you're part of. Now, neuroscience can capture some of that, but only a very limited part at this stage. So in a sense, the negative part of that project was realizing how limited science still is, or that particular version of science. And of course, neuroscience is really, it's a big thing at the moment. It's one of the main languages we talk about ourselves in. Realizing how limited that actually is in capturing what we're talking about. Yeah, I think we're still beginning to encounter some of these problems and issues, and to take the role of consciousness more seriously and in different ways. And there's a tradition of thought which you may be familiar with, because it has some at least of it has had important contributions from the Hispanic context, which is the mode of thought that goes back to people like Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, and the sort of inactive approach to meditation and to consciousness more generally. I mean, that already sees consciousness as part of a much wider and more total context. And for me, that is a very promising way to go. But I don't think we're anywhere near there yet, and I'm not sure we're ever going to get there in quite that sense.
Yeah. So, it comes to my mind, the Greeks used to say that the theory has to have a basis, or the practice should have also a good basis in theory. That what you are trying to explain to me and to all the people who are going to see us in this video. So, from the practical point of view, could you just, like say a few words or lead or mention like a short meditation from the Tibetan Buddhist techniques in order for people to be able to follow or to practice or understand it? Because I know there are so many techniques, such a variety of techniques, but you're an expert in this matter, in this subject. So you are so kind, just, to say a few tips, a few points, just to give some hints, some explanation, instruction, how to do, you got satsang or many other, different techniques over there, or using a mandala, or using a jantra, or visualizing something, or even that we later on you can say something about the subtle body and the different chakras and so on and so forth.
Yes. I'm not. It's quite difficult to do something quickly, I think, of that kind. What I think what I think for me is interesting in the way Tibetan tantric practice works, and I think it's one of the keys perhaps to a lot of these practices, is the sense that you are using the deity or the image of the deity within the mandala as a way to shape how your mind and body might operate. And again, there is a kind of flow that ideally is set up. At the moment, I'm working through material on long life meditation, long life tantric practices in Tibet. And so I think one of the interesting things about medicine and health in our society is that, and it's the issue that in a way has kind of grown up around the concept of the placebo, although I think a placebo is a very limiting way to look at it, is that a large part of the process of healing isn't something that medical science can really do much about. People, you can intervene in all sorts of ways, but it's also true that you can't be sure why or how people recover or don't recover. The more you move from the statistical level to the individual level, the less you can say about that. And I think looking at Tibetan medicine, part of what is going on is that the Tibetan doctor attempts a much more subtle and individual approach to the balances or imbalances within the individual, but to move to the context of tantric practice. And one of the things a Tibetan doctor might do is to, in a sense, prescribe tantric practice, because there tends to be a backwards and forwards process between them.
What does the tantric practice consist of, generally?
Yeah, well, I'm coming to that. So you might, for example, be looking at a deity like Emeritus, who is one of the primary deities of long life. or another is like Torah, but anyway, we'll stay with Islamic pious at the moment. And so you can see Amitas as a figure that has, well, obviously at some level, he and she, if it's a male and female version, often is, have a positive relationship to the energies of the universe around them. They and there's a kind of both an outward flow of contact and an inward flow of energy, which is based on an idea of the universe as being fundamentally positive, as being motivated, if you like, by love and compassion. And so if you are somebody who maybe is sick, is not feeling very good about it, and the world seems threatening, in old Tibet, you might see this in terms of possibilities of spirit attack. In our days, we might see it in different ways. But if you set up a relationship with this image, and the image may be in a mandala with a whole series of positive surrounding figures that are reinforcing it in various ways, you're consciously moving between where you are and another possibility of being, which perhaps enables you to adjust, and here I think not consciously, but much more through the ongoing process, your mind, body, consciousness, environment, interactions, to a healthier and more positive form. So, I mean, what looks like, these rather weird deities with several arms and all sorts of attributes and strange colors, which normal human beings aren't quite like, what are you supposed to be doing with them? And why can't we do something kind of simple and straightforward, like Vipassana or mindfulness practice? There's actually a quite subtle and quite complex process going on here, which in some ways actually goes back to early Buddhism and to the idea of the Buddha as a model that you are emulating in various ways, but now in a more complex and subtle way. I think to look at some of the more complex Tibetan practices in that way makes a lot of sense. I'm not all that sure often how useful it is to get more directly into the more philosophical side of the practices, until you have some kind of grounding in the whole world that they are part of. I think I'm not saying that one should not try to gain an understanding of how the world is viewed in Buddhism, but I think it's also possible to try too hard to get there too fast, to kind of shortcut the process development that's involved. It's a bit like the Tibetan preliminary practices where you do 100,000 prostrations and 100,000 recitations of this mantra and the mandala offerings and so on. If you come from our culture, there's a certain desire to just get on with the process, can't we?
But in a sense, it's very ritualistic as well, in a sense, right? Just just in order to transform your state of being, your state of body, mind, probably. But as you said, we belong to the philosophy of the immediacy. We just want things right now. You plant the seed and you already want the fruit. So we don't have any time just to water it properly. So it seems to me, very, very interesting. So we need to develop patience and dedication at the same time. So going for a moment back to, what is your opinion about yoga and Tantrism? Because yoga is based some part of it, at least part of the Hatha Yoga is based on Tantrism. There is a Tantric Buddhism, and then there appear later on different texts. I think to remember from the 10th century onwards about different techniques of Hatha Yoga. So we use tantric methods here, like from the sexual point of view. I mean, in the West, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But what is that movement consist of? How is it that they speak about a subtle, invisible body, the invisible, body mechanism, like the astral body, like the chakras, like all these type of, hidden mechanisms that we do not accept here. And at the same time, this pranic system just to wake up the famous Kundalini. Is it really so? Does it exist or not? Is it a lot of literature about that? I mean, what is your opinion? Because you are this, I think the book I showed it before, but your lovely book, I try to remind it all the time about people.
I edited, I didn't write, I co-edited a book a few years after that, which was specifically about the subtle body. And it was what I was trying to do there, and Jay Johnson, who I wrote it, edited it with, I think we're trying to do really was to say, look, this is a mode of thinking which you can find over very many human cultures, and it wouldn't be there if there wasn't something behind it. Yeah, I think the subtle body is, and I'm using subtle body in a quite wide sense here because there are more specific ways of using it and they're wider. But I think for me what is interesting here is in part that you have a level of a way of looking at things which is somewhere in between the physical and the mental and psychic, and contains elements of both. So, of course, I mean, that's not entirely alien to Western thought. I think it's very much part of what Jung was getting at, for example, and both with the archetypes and later on with the idea of the psychoid. But I think, again, it's maybe important not to get too fixated on the language and to see it more in terms of process. For me, the point about the chakras and the nadis and the inner flow of prana and so on is not so much that this is a set of things going on. It's not that this is an accurate map of processes in the body. It's more that it's a guide to reshaping processes within the body. I've tried to write about that a bit in a couple of recent things, and I hope to write a bit more about it. But I think this is one of the areas which is quite difficult to handle scientifically, and partly because there's a kind of tendency to jump to, oh, well, this is all about processes inside the nervous system or something, and the chakras are really equivalent to particular locations in the body. And I think if you look at different sets of ideas in within the various Hindu tantric systems, within the various Buddhist tantric systems, within the Taoist practices, which again use very similar kinds of languages, within some Sufi practices, which also have subtle centers within the body, then you begin to sense that this is less about this is what the body is really like, and we dumb Westerners can't see it. and it's more about how do we, again, reshape ourselves in a more positive and healthy and productive way. And so, some of the ways in which the Tibetan practices link together the emotional, the bodily, the sexual, so flows of sexual substances and sexual arousal and so on are part of the picture, and link them all to the bodhicitta, to the idea of compassion, and this becomes a way of harnessing quite very strong and powerful human impulses and directing them towards a particular goal, which is in this case, the Buddhist enlightenment, or some subsidiary goal in relation to that. So I tend to see these things more in that way, and I think in some ways that also goes more naturally together with the way in which they're approached within, certainly within Tibetan society. And I mean, I think there's no doubt that you can do things with the subtle body, if you like. And my friend Maria, the neuroscientist who I mentioned before, has done quite a lot of work on tumma. These are the practices that, one level, generate heat within the body, and they're very closely related, I think, to the Kundalini practices. They use similar breathing techniques, and again, there is a goddess at the base of the spine who is being awakened, Chandali Tumma, it's certainly possible to use the visualization to gain a level of control over the autonomic nervous system and over bodily processes, which we don't normally have, I think. But the real issue, and I think this is something that Maria is also very clear about, is where does it take you in the longer term, in terms of human development? It's not so much can you raise the temperature in your armpits by 3 degrees centigrade, which you can, but it's can you go around at night on a freezing cold winter's night in Tibet, drying off wet blankets or something,
Yeah, that's what we saw in Dr. Herbert Benson documentary, where he went there to Tibet to see all the lamas doing this tummo meditation, right?
Well, I think Benson did some early work on it. I think things have moved on a bit since then, but yeah, I suppose you get the basic point there. The point isn't really so much to generate heat. The point, obviously, that has a certain, how can I put it, publicity value if you're living in country like Tibet. Right. It's and of course that's also part of the way these things operate. I mean, just as in the West we have our ways of selling what we produce, I think there's a certain amount of showmanship about quite a bit of Tibetan practice too. But the real point is that this is a way to move along a certain path of human development that allows the achievement of higher levels of human functioning and human relating to each other and to the wider world. And that's the point about the chakras and these languages ultimately.
Yeah, because even nowadays in our society too, there is a big interest in chakras and meditation, manipulating the chakras, waking up the energy, and all these type of things. So in Tantrism, we got basically these left and right hand movements. So as far as sex is concerned, all these the 5 M's, I think, to remember in the left hand Tantrism, Maituna. So is that real? Is that connection, sexual connection? Was it part of the instructions, part of the teachings in Tantrism?
You mean in the Buddhist context?
In the Buddhism, I think the Indic and the Indian Tantric actually, first of all, I think was developed by Buddhism and then was taken by the Hindu Tantrism, if that is
Well,
possible.
I really don't know. I think maybe it was happening across the various Hindu traditions, across the Buddhists, across the Jains, maybe in contact with the Chinese too, you know. I don't know. I mean, my feeling is that if, and I put it, if you're an Hindu yogic practitioner in the 8th century and you run into some Buddhist guy who's doing something similar but a bit different, you probably ask them for a few hints, you know, you try to understand what they're doing. You see this, you know, you're less interested, just like people like the Baals today in Bengal, you know, you're less interested in what defines you than in the fact that you're kind of in the same game and you can learn from each other, you know.
Right.
So I mean, obviously, Buddhism as an institution develops stories about how our way of doing things is better than their way of doing things, you know, and vice versa. I think as far as sexual practice is concerned, you can both overestimate and underestimate its significance. It's symbolically quite important, certainly in terms of the whole question of male-female balance and within the individual as well as in the wider context. It's also, there still is a quite real practice tradition with the Tibetans and using sexual practice as part of the process of meditative development. At the same time, most Tibetan yogic practitioners don't use it. For one thing, of course, a lot of them are monks and are ordained and supposed to be celibate, so that creates a problem. So it's one of a series of methods, a series of techniques by now. I think there was a period when it was probably somewhat more important. But I think also, I mean, Tibet is a very different place from India. And I think sexuality and celibacy and these issues in the Indian context, certainly in the, you know, sort of relatively contemporary Indian context that I know, and perhaps you know a fair amount about too, has a certain value, you know, in a sort of in a society that has high demands of purity and moral behavior of a particular kind.
I suppose it has to do, as you mentioned in your book, it has to do with asceticism in the beginning and sannyas and renunciation. I mean, that fighting between the family people and those who used to renounce in the world, and therefore there was that type of controversy between those, let's say, two groups. So I don't want to take you too long. So I come to ask you the last question. What is your opinion about yoga? I mean, in your book, you come all the way from the Indus Valley, you know, until the 13th century, more or less. Is where you treat all these different techniques and study yoga, Tantrism, Buddhism, and Jainism. So many people say, okay, yoga started in the Indus Valley, of course, with those figurines, with those symbols, but it seems to be this idea has been dismissed by the erudites nowadays. So where does, according to your thought, yoga start? You know, because nowadays also, if we come all the way from there to our present moment, with the contemporary or modern yoga, we also see a big difference. You got in this modern yoga context, the different teachers, different traditions, like Shivananda tradition, like Krishnamacharya, and so on and so forth. So everything has changed so much. But from the tradition itself, could you give like a very short survey, from that moment? Let's say in a few minutes, we are going to go through 3,000 years or something like that, the way up to here. How you say, how is your perspective about, what is your vision about these yoga practices and movements and the sramanas in those moments when everything started with asceticism and purification, and the different texts that nowadays are being studied and published according to the Hatha project with Jay Manson, Mark Singleton, and some other very highly interested people.
Yes, I think they've been doing some very interesting work. A lot of it is kind of, as you said, kind of post-tantric. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of the tradition of what we maybe call postural yoga now, the asanas and did grow up as a kind of accessory to tantric practice. But prehistory is yoga before that. I'm in the Origins of Yoga and Tantra book. I suppose probably fairly conventionally by now, I was saying there's this period in about the 7th, 8th, 9th century when all this new stuff comes in, and at least it comes to the surface, it becomes visible very quickly. And it happens within Buddhism, within Jainism, within the different Hindu traditions, particularly Shaivism. That's when the elaborate systems of chakras and nadis and internal flows become significant. It's when the
in the 7th century or something like that, more or less.
Yeah. Now, I mean, there is a prehistory in India, certainly before that, and we see yogic type practice being used in various ways, but we don't seem to see the more complex postural procedures, and the breathing practices, use of breath seems to be simpler. All this is a bit arguable and debatable. I think we always need to remember with India that there's an awful lot going on, and we only have a fairly small part of it that's come down through particular lines and traditions. I mean, this is particularly so when you move back to the Vedic period, I think, which is why I was trying to fit together as much as possible of the archaeology and the iconography and so on to get some sense of a wider picture. So, like you get all those wonderful terracotta images from Chandraketa in Bengal and areas around there, which seem to be about something quite a bit different from our picture of Indian religion at the time. And you seem to have different things again going on in the south, and we have a bit of information about that. I mean, as you probably picked up from the book, I'm one of the people who's rather cynical about what we can know about Indus-Valley religion. I think all those seal images are wonderful, but I have no idea what they mean. And it's pretty clear that people have read a lot of different things into them. And of course, at the moment, also all this is terribly political because of the desire of the contemporary Indian state to see a particular sort of Hindu history as being a part of their, if you like, their state building project. which means that it's actually quite difficult for a lot of people in India who maybe know more about what's going on to talk about it.
Right.
But I think it's clear that there are meditative processes of different kinds that people were experimenting with, certainly back to the time of the Shramana traditions, and I also think it's quite clear there that this is a kind of shared milieu of Hindus or pre-Hindu groups and Buddhist groups and Jain groups and whatever, that they're talking to each other, they're sharing material. And one of the things I was trying to do in the origins of yoga and Tantra was to make the case of that as strong as possible, because I think it's an important case to understand how far those religions share things, those traditions share things, and I think that undercuts also this sense of, one is better than another, and one is more significant than another one. I don't think it's quite. I think they're developing together in many ways, and in relation to each other. So that will be at least part of my answer there. I don't think we can say anything about the Indus Valley, and as I said, in terms of yogic practice, I just don't think the material we have allows us to say that.
And this controversy about the Aryans came over, or else the Dravidians were already there, and it started in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, or
Yeah.
they mixed together. All this big debate keeps going on and on with different authors talking about different ways of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to know more, but
Yeah.
I don't think we do at this stage. And I think there is this problem. As I said, our evidence is quite limited. So you look at early Sanskrit, the early Sanskrit of the Vedas, and then you discover that, okay, we've got something similar but different going on in Iran. And then you discover, well, a closely related language and many of the same concepts and so on. And then you find that some are over in what's now Turkey, with in the Mitanni people, you have some group of people wandering around who seem to have what we'd recognize as Brahmanical gods, and they're writing about them in cuneiform. And then you get people like, Ascopopola in some ways is one of my heroes. He's a wonderfully creative mind, but it seems to me that by the time you've tried to fit all these things together into some kind of consistent picture, that it's become so speculative that it's really not telling you anything very useful. And there are technical reasons about the archaeology and about the dating that make it rather difficult to tie things down much more. I'm sure we'll find out some more, and particularly if and when we get to a stage when serious archaeology becomes possible through a lot of the region. And of course, if things are bad in India, they're worse in places like Afghanistan. Where
so coming from just to end up our conversation here, very, very enriching and interesting from your side. If we are coming back to our modern times, we see, all these methods and techniques like yoga, but basically the emphasis is put in the asanas. Basically, that is what, when we talk about yoga, usually we speak about that. And when we speak about meditation, we do speak about basically mindfulness. So in my opinion, the essence, what is behind all these methods or these systems, as I mentioned previously, is being put aside in a corner. So those who devote ourselves in a sense to teach yoga meditation sometimes we come across with difficulty. Just if you go back, for instance, to the, as I mentioned before as well, to the Upanishads, okay, you got the word, what yoga, and they say it appears in the Katha Upanishad, for instance, in the beginning, but these textual sources in the Hatha Yoga project are putting the emphasis in a very highly interested way in the text itself, what it contains, what they teach, or they used to teach in those, 11th century, 12th century. But I suppose before the appearance of these written texts in these traditions used to be a way of moving, a way of living, a way of practicing that we are not able to trace. Therefore, if we put also the emphasis just to look at the systems from the 10th century, 11th century, we are losing a lot of the background that we are not able to trace it, just to find it, just to follow it, just to discover it. So I mean by this probably that we still have a long way to go in order to research and then analyze what all these, countries like India, like many Asian countries, Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar, and Thailand, and Sri Lanka. I mean, from the Buddhist perspective, from the Buddhist knowledge, and also the yogic knowledge. So I think yourself, you have it synthesized very nicely, everything you are saying about these traditions or methods. And I very deeply recognize your knowledge and your kindness to be with me during this day, this morning here in Spain, night there in Australia. And I have you in high esteem and consideration, and really thank you very much indeed for your time that you have spent with me. And I am sure that all your knowledge and your experience in the different fields, Buddhism, meditation, Asian medicine, and so on and so forth, is going to be of great interest to all the viewers of our video. So, Professor Samuel, Geoffrey Samuel, I really very much indeed thank you very deeply. I want to show you my gratitude for this moment that you have spent with me today.
Well, thank you very much for that. I feel I've tended to give rather complicated answers to your questions, and maybe that's inevitable from where I am at the moment. But I hope maybe there are some.
That is what you need. That is what you need, just to go deep into the subject, because as I mentioned before, people want simple things and very quick answers, and trying to clarify every doubt. And we know that is not easy. Therefore, we need, experts like yourself who know the topic so deeply. We need to go there just in order to understand, and shed some light upon these difficult topics. Actually, I would say,
Oh, I hope so. Anyway, look, thank you very much for having me on the program. It's been a pleasure for me too, and I've really enjoyed myself. Actually, it's been good to meet you too.
Okay, Professor. So we'll be in touch. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. All the best.